Tonight, however, we're going to explore the world of the very small. So small, in fact, that until recently, none of us had ever seen it. No microscope was powerful enough to help us see it. We're going to talk about building things atom by atom. We're going to see why, at scales less than the wavelength of light, everyday physics and chemistry are different. Finally, we're going to see why nanotechnology is important to all of us. We have two of our faculty members here with us tonight. One is an expert in atomic force microscopy. That's how you see nanotechnology things. The other is an expert in molecular scale devices. Dr. Nancy Burnham is a professor in our physics department. She is the expert, indeed a pioneer in atomic force microscopy. After earning the PhD at the University of Colorado in Boulder, she became a National Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the Naval Research Laboratory, a von Humboldt fellow in Germany, a 6-year tour of duty at the École Polytechnique in Switzerland, and brief stays at the University of Bordeaux, the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. She became a professor at WPI in our physics department 4 years ago. Dr. Grant McGimpsey is a professor in our chemistry and biochemistry department. He is the expert in molecular scale devices and holds several patents in this area. Grant is the director of our Molecular Engineering Center and is the Associate Director for Business Development in our Bioengineering Institute. Grant earned the PhD at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and went on to postdoctoral assignments at the National Research Council and a visiting appointment at the Max Planck Institute. He joined WPI in 1989. So, with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Burnham, and she's going to spend a few minutes delivering her talk to you. She's then going to introduce Grant, and after that, we're going to entertain questions and discussion. So please, save up some good questions so we can have a lively discussion. Nancy?
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, great. It's nice to see such a full room. Nanotechnology is something I've been doing for 16 years, and I could certainly talk for all night about it. It's really, really cool, but I've promised to keep myself to half an hour. And in the preparation for this talk, what I've assumed is that you're a knowledgeable person and you're educated and intelligent. But perhaps you don't know so much about what this word means. And perhaps you've read about it in Business Week or Time or in the Boston Globe. And perhaps you've even gotten emails saying, invest in nanotechnology, you'll make $1 million. So wise investors, here it comes. Oops. Okay, so I've organized my talk as a series of questions for you, the curious visitor. First question is, what is a nanometer? What is this nano prefix? And then what are nanoscience and what is nanotechnology? There are two different approaches to nanoscience and technology, NST. One is called top-down and the other one is called bottom-up. And so I'll explain what those mean. What makes nanoscience and technology so interesting? And nanoscience is different. I'm not sure. Once again, I could talk all night about why nanoscience is different. And I hope to get a little bit across to you. There are a number of ways that it's different, and I'll briefly introduce those. And I'd also like you to know about an example student research project. Indeed, as Bill Durgin mentioned, that maybe some of you are prospective students, and I want you to know what all of the seniors at WPI must do. And at the end, there'll be some acknowledgments for both the funding and for the handouts that we have up here. So what is a nanometer? This prefix nano comes from the Greek word dwarf, so it means small. And in science, it means 10 to the minus 9, or a billion. And so a nanometer is something that is a billionth of a meter. And that is really, really small. It is smaller than the wavelength of visible light. And what I like to tell people is that the ratio of a nanometer to a meter is the same ratio as that of a millimeter to the distance between the Museum of Science, where we're sitting here in this theater, and Detroit. Okay? So a nanometer is really, really, really small. The typical atomic distance between atoms is on the order of a quarter to a third of a nanometer. And this graphic here is made by an instrument that I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And what it is it's a material called a carbon nanotube, that cylindrical looking thing, sitting on a piece of graphite. And the graphite is the thing with all the bumps on it. And so each bump is an individual carbon atom. And so indeed, we can look at atoms and we can actually manipulate things atom by atom, which is one of the reasons why this field is so exciting to us. So these little bumps are carbon atoms, and in this particular material, they're 2.5 angstroms apart, or in other words, a quarter of a nanometer. What are nanoscience and technology? It's sort of two different viewpoints on the same thing. Nanoscientists are the people who are more interested in the fundamentals. We want to understand why things work the way they do. We want to be able to predict the behavior of things. Nanotechnologists are more interested, they're the engineers, and they tend to like to build things. They were the little kids putting stuff together in the basement. And so we are complementary. Personally, I have a nanoscience viewpoint. I'm more asking in the why and how. And a nanotechnologist will say, well, how can I use that to make a really neat device or make something that's going to make me a lot of money? But we need each other because it's the nanotechnologists who make things that get sold to people, and that drives the money cycle. And they make use of what nanoscientists study. And nanoscientists are just sort of like myself, they were just hobbyists. We do this for fun. Okay? What are the different approaches to nanoscience and technology? Here's this first thing called top-down. And what that means is if we can make something smaller, we can make more of it per unit area. And if the little components in this device are closer together, the device will operate more quickly and will be able to make things more cheaply. And this philosophy is what has driven the computer revolution, and I assume most of you have a computer at home or work with one in your office. And you know how the performance of computers has improved so much in the last decade. And so the computer people say, well, let's make it smaller, faster, and cheaper. So whereas you used to have 1,000 transistors on an Intel 888, and now we have 2.4 million transistors on a Pentium, this lets Intel make more money. What we have pictured up here are devices called accelerometers and gyroscopes that are made by a company, Analog Devices, that sits right behind MIT. And we have a collaboration with them in order to help understand why these devices work the way they do and why they sometimes have problems. So we at WPI are helping Analog lay the knowledge base for their next generation of devices. you'll find these things. This is an accelerometer in most every automobile. These things are the things that say, aha, I've just crashed into a tree, let me deploy the airbag. So the other approach, called bottom-up, is the viewpoint of, well, gee, I know a lot about molecules and forces and the interaction between small volumes of material. Let's let those forces take care of themselves and use our knowledge of surface forces and molecular interactions to let things grow themselves. I mean, the most complicated example of that is standing in front of you and is in each one of these chairs in this room. You are a self-assembled organism. Now, not all self-assembled organisms have to be alive. What we have here is a study that some colleagues at Pacific Northwest Lab did of the growth of copper oxide on a flat substrate. And here we have some images of all the different forms these copper oxide islands can take depending on the growth conditions. So the nanoscientist says, well, I've got to understand how these different growth conditions give me these different sizes and shapes. The nanotechnologist says, okay, now that I know about that, what can I design? What can I make? What makes nanoscience and technology so interesting? Or just the size scale. It's so small. 10 to the minus 9 is really very, very small, and it's really neat that we're able to image these things and manipulate them and control them and start to make some products that Grant will tell you about. And because of how things are different on a small scale than at a human scale, which we'll get to in a moment, there really is a possibility of significantly improving technology. And as I mentioned a moment ago, you've already seen this in terms of the improvement in your computers and your cell phones, and so forth and so on. Okay, so here's the slide that I could take another 2 hours or 2 days on. How is nanoscience different? And just running quickly through them, just to say the words, I've identified 5 different ways that I think are important in about how behavior at small scales is different than at large scales. First one is the difference between quantum mechanics and continuum mechanics. Second one is when you have a few atoms or a few molecules, you're dealing with something that scientists say is a small statistical ensemble. Though these very, very small scales, nothing is flat. When you learn solid-state physics, for example, you're always assuming, well, the solid is an infinite half-space, okay, and it's flat and it just takes up space. That's not the way it is. You saw a few slides ago that the surface of an atomically flat piece of graphite is very bumpy. Okay. When structures are small, there's a possibility of making them defect-free. And when they're defect-free, they tend to have superior mechanical and material properties as just your normal structure. The surface-to-volume ratio of objects is much, much different. And I mentioned surface forces a while ago. When you have a very, very small object and say there's a nanonewton acting upon it, it's much more likely that that nanonewton of force is going to get the small object to move than, for example, this laser pointer. A nanonewton of force on this laser pointer is insignificant. So just by the very fact that you start to shrink things, you start to see different things happening. So let me give you sort of two examples of this one and this one, just to expose the kind of thinking. Okay. So here I have a tennis ball, and this calls for audience participation. If I throw the tennis ball at the wall, at the door, what's going to happen? Let's see. You're right. Okay, very good. Now, what if this were an electron? And I threw the electron at the equivalent of the wall. What can happen?
Penetrate.
It can go through. Okay? So if you've never heard about that before, that sounds really, really wild and really, really strange. But that is one of the wonderful things about quantum mechanics, is that very, very small particles have the possibility of going through what we think is solid objects. Okay? And this has led to all sorts of interesting devices. One of the new things happening on the scene is something called quantum computing, and that's still in the very, very early stages, but it does offer very, very interesting possibilities for encryption and for the very, very large calculations that some scientists are trying to do. So let's see, how are we doing on time? About halfway through, so I can say a little bit more, I think, on the statistical ensemble. So I have Professor McGimpsey's water glass here. And if I took a heater and put it underneath the water glass, what temperature would it boil? 212. Or 212 Fahrenheit or 100 Celsius. That's right. And if the environmental conditions are the same, the pressure and so forth, no matter where we were, we'd still get that result. Now, imagine that we were able to, if he would allow us to do this, extract 100 water molecules. Is that all right, Grant?
That's fine.
Okay. So let's say we've shrunk this to 10 water molecules. Does anybody know what's going to happen if we try and boil 100 water molecules? What happens? It doesn't come up so much. But what happens is you don't have as many molecules to sort of take the average, if you will. The boiling temperature is like an average result of a huge number of molecules. So in other words, if we took Grant's 100 molecules, we don't know if they're going to boil at 99 C or 101 C. Okay. Now that's a little bit scary in that, oh my goodness, how are we going to build things and do things if we don't know these really important properties of even plain water? But actually, like the computer programmers who say, well, it's not a bug, it's a feature. There are ways people are thinking about ways to use that to your advantage. Nothing is flat, nothing is continuous. Didn't bring a good prop to show that one, but let me tell you about it a little bit anyway. There are molecules that you can make, and you can put them down on a surface, and you can make them, they're long and thin, and you can make them such that they either stand up or bend over. And you can use the fact that when you've got a small object passing over those molecules, that the friction is different this way than this way to control the movement of the small objects on the surface. Now, if the surface were just one infinite half space, as we learn in physics, there would be no directionality. So the fact that you've got Instead of a flat surface, you've got individual molecules there, and you can tailor the shape of those molecules to what you want to do. That gives you a form of control over how one thing is rubbing along the surface of the other thing. Defect-free structures, as I mentioned before, the presence or absence of defects can have a big, big effect on the material properties. One example of this was that cylinder that I showed you a few slides ago. Those things are called carbon nanotubes, and you can make them in a number of different ways. And if you make them in a way that has lots of defects in them, they tend not to be very strong, and you put them down on a surface and they sort of go in this lazy S pattern. But if you make them a different way, such that their internal structure is like a chicken lattice, okay, where a carbon atom sits at each one of these intersections here. And what they naturally do is roll over and bind up like this. So here's your carbon nanotube cylinder. They can be almost defect-free. And those carbon nanotubes, oh, you wouldn't really think much of it, would you? They're sort of like graphite. Same material, same construction. They're just graphite rolled up. But in fact, they're really amazing. They have the strength of, or the stiffness of diamonds. They have a very, very high strength. They're very light. They are, 100 times stronger than steel with 1/6 the density. They have very interesting electrical properties that Grant will talk about. And they're only the only material that we know of at the moment with which we could build what Arthur C. Clarke wrote about in Fountains of Paradise, which is space elevator. That's right. So, and believe it or not, NASA has a website on this. So, someone at NASA is either crazy or they think it's possible. Surface to volume ratio. Okay, so I have an eraser at the end of my pencil here. I'm going to rub it on a transparency, and I will come over to this woman here and ask you, what do you see?
I see two smears and a lot of different size specks
Right.
of the eraser.
Okay, so you see big specks and little specks.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is your prediction or the prediction of the people around you? If I hold this now instead of horizontally, I hold it vertically and shake it, what will happen?
Most will fall off, but not all.
That's right. Most will fall off, but not all. So
I know
we're
this from housework.
okay. Were we right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the big ones fell off, but the small ones stuck. So what's happening here is the same thing that was happening with the self-assembled structures, in that the big ones were big enough such that their weight pulled them off, whereas the small ones are relatively light, and the surface forces acting between the little eraser bits and the transparency are keeping them on. Okay, so this is not something that's happening at the nanoscale, but it does show you that size matters. Okay, so now I'm leading up to tell you about a senior research project. And in order to describe that well, I have to describe the instrument that the student is using. It's called a scanning probe microscope. Scanning probe microscopy is a general name for a very important class of microscopes in nanoscience and technology. The specific microscope that Bill mentioned earlier, atomic force microscope, is the one that the student is using. And another important type of microscope is called the scanning tunneling microscope. And it was with that instrument that you saw the pictures of the self-assembly and the carbon nanotube. So how this class of microscopes work is the following. We have a very, very sharp tip, typically atomically sharp, or certainly less than 100 nanometers sharp at the end. There's some sort of interaction between the tip and the sample. That could be a current, it could be force, it could be optical. Your imagination is the limit on this. That interaction tends to vary with position and distance. And we take this probe and we get it near a sample or in contact with the sample. And we use a computer and some electronics and a piezoelectric scanner to move the sample back and forth. And at the same time we're moving the sample back and forth, there's some means of detecting the strength of the interaction between the sample and the tip. And that information is fed into a computer. And the computer plots the strength of the interaction as a function of the X and Y position of the scanner, such that you get a recreation of the surface of the scanner. And depending on what it is and all the different conditions, that it is possible to get atomic resolution, as you saw on the pictures of graphite and carbon nanotube. So as far as the senior research project is concerned, this is what Aaron Kazauka is doing. He's a senior WPI in physics, and he is working on carbon nanotubes. And we're interested in the shear properties of the carbon nanotubes. And he has, along with a previous student, has come up with a method by which to look at the shear stiffness of the tubes. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing a 1 micron by 1 micron image, where on the left, the colors represent height. So it's like taking a picture of the topography. And the difference in height between the light and the dark here, light is up, dark is down, is 15 nanometers. 1 micron, by the way, is 1,000 nanometers. So this is a long, thin cylinder. This particular nanotube is a little unusual. This kind of nanotube tends to be perfectly straight. This particular one has a slight kink in it here. And you see this end is a little bit wider and fatter, or taller, than this end here. See, it's white here and yellow here. The shear amplitude image, we're still in the process of understanding this, but it's really, really neat, I think. Is what it is we're taking the tip of the atomic force microscope, putting it in contact with the carbon nanotube, and we are oscillating the tip back and forth just a little bit. And that tip tends to twist, and that twisting motion tells us about essentially the lateral stiffness of the carbon nanotube. What's so unusual here is right at the break, at this kink where it gets a little bit lighter, you also see a change in the shear amplitude image. We don't know yet if that is related to a change in the internal structure of the carbon nanotube. I think it probably will be. Or if by some magic there's a difference in that surface interaction between the substrate and the tube. Okay? And I think this is pretty neat what he's been able to do, because there's been very little research in this area, and he's actually contributing to a research program. I'm on time. So, acknowledgments. My lab in particular is funded by Analog Devices. I showed you some pictures of of what they do a little bit earlier. We've gotten some grants from Sigma Xi, which in fact 2 students have written for grants and received them, and also from my school, WPI. If you didn't get a handout on the way in, you're welcome to a handout on the way out. And, oh, I see that 2 pictures didn't print on it. That's too bad. One of them was the graphite image that you saw a moment ago. Let me go refresh your memory. There it is. That's one that should be on there that isn't. And lots of different people contributed to this handout. They all belong to a society called the AVS, the Science and Technology Society, of which I'm a member and the treasurer for 1,300 people, scientists from all over the world. And it's just great to go to one of those conferences because we talk about stuff like this all day. And so it's their images that I've shown you and are here, as well as the image of this one here was done in my lab. So we thank all those people for their support and their participation. And I guess it's time now to introduce our next speaker, Professor Grant McGimpsey.
Thanks, Nancy, for a very exciting lecture. I found it particularly stimulating because I was watching my water glass the whole time, worried about maybe drowning my computer with it.
All right.
So nanotechnology, the next small thing. I think based upon some of the things that Nancy has told us, we've maybe got the stage set to talk about some applications. I'm going to go over just a couple of things first, maybe reiterate. I'm supposed to step into the light, okay. To reiterate some of the things that Nancy has told you, just to kind of make sure everybody's straight on them. And then we'll talk about some specific applications of nanotechnology and show you some good pictures. I have to say, like Nancy, I could probably talk about this for quite some time. And also, like Nancy, I've been involved in nanotechnology for quite a while. I've probably been involved my entire career because chemists are really nanotechnologists. We've been studying molecules and studying atoms for a long time. And so we're kind of the original nanotechnologists or nanoscientists. Okay, so we'll just quickly go through maybe kind of a chemist's impression of the what, the why, and the how of nanotechnology, and the who as well. What sorts of scientists and engineers are involved in nanotechnology. And then I'm going to talk about some applications, mainly through images, and particularly scanning probe microscopic images, things like AFM images and STM images, and concentrate primarily on molecular electronics. How do molecules and assemblies of molecules act like wires and switches? Talk about nanofabrication. Basically, how do we put together new materials to do new things, to build new devices? And then finally, the application of nanotechnology to medicine. And that's both medicine today and medicine of the future. Before I actually say this, as a chemist, I was basically trained as a classical chemist with classical chemical theory, molecular and atomic theory. And basically what that theory says, if you have 2 atoms and you get them close enough together, and they can share electrons, and you do that enough times, you can build molecules from those. And there's some pretty good indirect evidence to support that theory. But as a chemist, you're always basically being asked to take it on faith that things like atoms and molecules exist and that they behave in certain ways. And that was up until the development of the scanning tunneling microscope that Nancy mentioned. That actually allows you to visually image, not optically image, but to visually image individual atoms and molecules. And I've got some pictures of those. And that really was a revelation for me. It was a kind of a, it was telling me that maybe I hadn't made a mistake in becoming a chemist. So what is nanotechnology? We've really already kind of discussed this, but from a chemist's point of view, there are really kind of two types of nanotechnology, top-down and bottom-up. Let me just get the laser pointer here. I'm actually a photochemist, so I know how to use this laser pointer. Top-down nanotechnology uses techniques like photolithography to take big structures and make them smaller. It's kind of like a machining sort of attitude towards making material smaller. And a good example of this has been the reduction in size of electronic devices, semiconductor devices over the last 40 years, as Nancy mentioned. And the technology that's driven this reduction in semiconductor devices has been basically improvements in lithographic technologies. So it's basically taking known technologies, developing those further, and then applying them to make materials smaller. On the other hand, and this is really where chemists come into play, it's in the bottom-up nanotechnology. This uses the tendency of atoms to come together, to associate, and molecules to self-assemble into larger, what we call supramolecular structures that can perform useful tasks, that can perform useful functions. So bottom-up nanotechnology, molecules come together. They're programmed to come together either by their very nature, or chemists actually can program molecules so that they come together and form larger structures that can do new things or can do old things better. And an example of this, again, a molecular transistor could be a lot smaller than a typical semiconductor transistor. In the chips today, the semiconductor chips today, we're really talking about feature sizes of about 100 nanometers on a side. So the area of a device is roughly 10,000 square nanometers. If we could get a molecule or a small assembly of molecules to do the same thing as a semiconductor device does, we could reduce the size of that device by a factor of at least 10,000, because molecules are typically about a square nanometer in size. The why of that, it kind of leads into the question of why should we have nanotechnology? Why make things smaller? What's the benefit of making them smaller? And in the context of molecular electronics, as Nancy's really already alluded to, if you can make things smaller, you can make them run faster, and you can probably make them run cheaper. Now, if we think about a molecule acting as an electronic device, that molecule obviously is going to be smaller. Since it's smaller, the electrons that are running through it have to run smaller distances so they can work faster. And you can actually put fewer electrons through this small device, so you have a smaller current and you have a smaller cost, basically, of the electricity. The other really kind of disruptive, I don't know whether you've heard of the term disruptive technologies, but the disruptive thing about molecular electronics is that molecules that do electronic functions could potentially be a lot cheaper to make. As the top-down approach has shrunk semiconductor devices and continually shrunk them, they've gotten a lot more expensive to make. You need a lot better technologies to make smaller things. And the failure rate of today's semiconductor-based chips is still very high, probably in the 90% range. Molecules are a lot easier to make. They're a lot cheaper to make. You don't need all these clean room facilities that you do for semiconductor-based devices. And each molecule is the same. Each molecule is basically defect-free by definition. Otherwise, it wouldn't be that molecule. The how and the who, these are just kind of, I thought I knew how to use this. These are just kind of some of the technologies or the activities or the science that really kind of goes into nanotechnology. So if we're talking about bottom-up, we're really relying on self-assembly of molecules into larger structures. And that's really in the realm of the chemists. You can tell I'm a chemist because chemistry actually shows up quite a bit on this list. And the biochemists, because as Nancy said, the best example of a self-assembled object or self-assembled device is a living organism. If we want to actually take or design a new self-assembling molecule, we actually have to get into the lab, we have to design it, we have to make it, and that again is in the realm of the chemist. If we're talking about top-down approaches, we really need to have new ways of manipulating material, new materials, and that's in the realm of a large number of science and engineering disciplines. So there's a lot of people that can be involved in nanotechnology. So I'm going to talk about applications here, and I'll just talk about really these first three applications: molecular electronics. Something, I kind of call it manufacturing, but it's really just making new devices from materials. And then medicine. And there are a lot of other applications, and obviously we could spend a lot of time talking about those. So why would we want to make new electronics? Well, we've already kind of covered that. We want to make things smaller. We want to make them cheaper. What do you need when you want to make an electronic device? Essentially, you need wires and switches. Pretty well every electronic device that you use today is based upon some combination of wires and switches. And so the idea behind molecular electronics is to make molecules act like wires and make molecules act like switches, or find molecules that can fit together into larger assemblies that can perform those functions. So as far as molecules or supramolecular assemblies acting as wires, there are several examples that I can think of right off the top of my head. Conducting polymers, something I'm calling polychromophores. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And nanotubes, and Nancy's already introduced the subject of carbon nanotubes. Those aren't the only nanotubes. There are other nanotubular structures that can be used as wires, or that could be used as a scaffold for wires. Polychromophores, this is a really poorly resolved picture of a molecule. Basically, I'm giving myself a plug here, okay? This is some work we did a few years ago. This is a polychromophoric molecule, and as you can see the way I've drawn it, it's shaped a little bit like a wire, if you use your imagination. These things are called chromophores. They absorb light. And when you string together these different chromophores with these intervening molecular architectures, what you've created is an optically driven shift register, which is the basis for computer memory. It's the basis for high-resolution video displays. So this is a primitive example of a shift register. As I said, nanotubes can act as wires too, and before we get into the carbon nanotubes, I want to give myself another plug. This is a cyclic peptide nanotube. Cyclic peptide nanotubes themselves were first reported by a scientist by the name of Gadiri at Scripps Institute. What we've done is kind of built upon this idea of a cyclic peptide nanotube. We've attached interesting electronic features to the molecules. So right here, this is a molecular modeling representation, by the way, of a cyclic peptide nanotube. This is a cyclic peptide. A peptide is a string of amino acids that are joined together. You join enough of them together, you get a protein. What we do is we string together a series of amino acids that have these interesting electronic groups on them. This is a molecule called pyrene. And then we tie the ends together of the peptide, and we have a cyclic peptide. And when you do that, these cyclic peptides self-assemble into nanotubular structures. They just do it themselves, which is good because I couldn't imagine trying to manipulate these things to make nanotubes. The nice thing about it, basically I'm showing 6 cyclic peptides that are stacked together here now. They form nanotubular structures, and what happens is these pyrene molecules here, these interesting electronic groups, stack one on top of each other, and they form a conduit for electrons to pass through them. So electrons can pass from this side of the tube down to that side of the tube. So what we're doing here, we have a scaffold, basically the physical structure of the wire, and then we have the electronic functioning of the wire in these side groups right here. And I've got this little note down here, patent pending. That's really to point out that this is just not in the realm of some scientist's imagination. People are patenting structures like this, and they're doing so because there is real economic potential in molecular electronics. Pardon me?
What do you use it for?
This is a wire. Okay.
I mean, for what? For medicine? For
No, this is supposed to go into a molecular electronic device. So if you want to make a new transistor, or if you want to make a switch, or a new device of some kind, this is going to form one of the building blocks for that.
What's the diameter?
This is about 1.5. It's about 1.5 nanometers from this side to this side, and if you hang these groups off of it, it's probably about 2.5 nanometers wide. These are actually kind of interesting in themselves. They're hollow. You can put water inside of them. The pore dimension is about 0.75 nanometers.
Is it actually 2 wires?
I beg your pardon?
Is it 2 wires? Really?
Well, that kind of remains to be seen because we've yet to really incorporate this into electronic architecture. We're really kind of looking for redundancy here. We've made other molecules where there are 4 of these groups on a single cyclic peptide. So we're basically looking for as much conductivity as we can get.
How would you connect these to another part of the device?
Well, I mean, the idea is to bridge 2 metallic contacts with this. And there are some chemistries that you can include into a peptide that would allow you to self-assemble this onto a metallic surface. So, for example, if you want to put this down on gold, and gold is really kind of one of the best conductors, you put it down on gold, you can use an amino acid called cysteine, which has a sulfur atom in it, and that sulfur will form a very strong bond and a stable bond to the gold surface. So you could essentially put this down on a gold surface and then sputter gold on top of it, and you would have the molecule sandwiched between those 2 metal contacts. So now we move on to carbon nanotubes, and this is by far, you've probably heard of carbon nanotubes, whereas you may not have heard about cyclic peptide nanotubes. This is a modeling representation of a single-walled closed-end carbon nanotube. It's got a closed end there. And as Nancy pointed out, these are formed by rolling up graphite sheets. So here's our graphite sheet, and it turns out that you can get different electronic properties depending upon how you roll this up. So if you roll it up this way, you'll get one kind of property. If you roll it up kind of diagonally, you'll get a different property. You can get conducting properties, you can get semiconducting properties from these things. So people have a lot of hope that these carbon nanotubes will be very useful in molecular electronic architectures. Who's heard of buckyballs? Excellent. Wow. Okay. A buckyball is a C60 molecule. It looks like a part of a geodesic dome. It looks like a soccer ball, basically, only a lot smaller, obviously. These are kind of cousins of buckyballs, these structures. Okay. This is an actual scanning probe microscopic image of a carbon nanotube. Again, I lost the... There we go. This is 1 nanotube here. It's about 2 microns long, so it's pretty long. It's long in terms of an application in electronics. 2 microns is a long way in today's electronics. So it's certainly long enough. And in this inset, you can see just a blow-up, and it's probably about 10 nanometers wide. So these things come in all shapes and flavors and sizes. That's actually one of the drawbacks so far of trying to use carbon nanotubes in electronics, is trying to find a way to create a uniform size and shape for these nanotubes. What happens now is more or less you burn carbon and then you go fishing and you fish out the shapes that you like. Although there has been a fair amount of research lately in trying to find a rational way to get uniform sized nanotubes. You know, as soon as a new material is discovered or is reported, then the scientists have to get in on the act, if they haven't already been, and have some fun with it. And so this image is another, I believe it's an STM, scanning tunneling microscopic image of a URL for NASA Ames, a research center, www.nano.gov, and it's spelled out with carbon nanotubes. These nanotubes have been manipulated, moved around on a surface by using the tip of an STM, a scanning tunneling microscope. And as you can see here, the width is about 20 nanometers. And not to be outdone, scientists at IBM thought they would get in on it too, and they've used an AFM, an atomic force microscope, to move nanotubes around on a surface and spell or to form the Greek letter theta with the AFM tip.
That Don Eigler's group?
You know what? I think this is out of Zurich.
Oh, Zurich.
I think I'll get the name later on. Anyway, so it's kind of fun, obviously, to discover new materials and new ways of manipulating materials. I'm not exactly sure what the actual application of this would be, but it's fun, but don't count on doing it anytime soon, because this is the sort of equipment you need to do it with. This is not something you're going to do in your basement. One of the ways to get really nice images like the URL that I just showed you, or the Greek letter theta, is to do these experiments in chambers at very low pressures. Basically, you want as hard a vacuum as you can get. We're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 10 to the minus 11 atmospheres, maybe even less, is it?
11 is correct.
Okay, so several trillionths of an atmosphere. And the reason for that is that you get rid of impurities, you get rid of any interference from any other matter around. And it's really expensive to generate this really hard vacuum. And so this is kind of a typical ultra-high vacuum setup. The chamber is down in here. The rest of it is just for sucking as much air out of the system as you possibly can get. And you're probably looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 to $2 million for a setup like this. So unless you're extremely wealthy, you're not going to be doing it in your basement. So kind of introduce the subject of nanotubes. So what can they do electronically? And I'll just show you a couple of examples. This is out of IBM again. I again believe this is out of Zurich. This is a nanotube as part of a construction of a field effect transistor. This is just a schematic of the transistor. We have the nanotube laid across two gold contacts on top of oxidized silicon or silica. And if you apply the correct potentials, the correct voltages, you can actually get current flowing through the nanotube. This is an actual, I believe, would this be STM or AFM?
It could be AFM.
Okay. It's one of the probe microscopic images. There's the gold contact. There's another gold contact. This is silica. And this is the nanotube stretched across there. And again, if you apply the correct voltages, you can basically turn this on and off. So it's acting as both a wire and a switch.
What would be your relative size?
This is probably, again, the width of this is probably in the order of 10 to 20 nanometers. So we're probably looking at, I would say, maybe half to 3/4 of a micron across there. It's definitely submicron. Another neat thing I came across, this is really fun putting this talk together because I came across a lot of really nice scanning probe microscopic images. This is a scanning electron microscope image of a whole slew of carbon nanotube rings. Okay, so these things have formed into ring-like structures. I think they're probably bundles of tubes that are in the ring-like structure rather than individual tubes. On the left here, we have an atomic force microscopic image of one of these rings laid across two gold contacts that are insulated. They're not in contact with each other. And this particular assembly has been used to measure the current that can flow through these nanotubes. So basically you apply a voltage across here and you look at the current that flows as a result. And that current has to be, unless it's tunneling through the space here, has to be flowing through the carbon nanotube ring. And not surprisingly, you've got current flowing in a ring. If you can affect or modulate the current by exposing magnetic field to this particular structure. Now, the idea, basically, we want to be able to eventually incorporate these carbon nanotubes into electronic structures, and so this is kind of a representation of almost a three-dimensional electronic structure. And what we'd be looking to do would be to take your carbon nanotube and stick it between two metallic contacts and use it either for its conducting or its semiconducting properties. Just to reiterate, what are the advantages of carbon nanotubes? Well, they have a small diameter. It's good to be small. I mean, Nancy's already talked about that. They have a high aspect ratio. They're a lot longer than they are wide. And as I said, if they're rolled up properly, they can be highly conductive. Or if they're rolled up in a different way, they can be semiconducting. And as Nancy pointed out, they have very high mechanical strength. How are we doing for time here? Okay. Not only carbon nanotubes can act as wires. You can have molecules, if they're assembled in the correct way, act as wires too. And this is really unfortunate. It was in focus at one point. These lines here are silicon atoms on a surface. Basically, they're presented in this kind of diagonal fashion because of the way that the silicon crystal is oriented. This is a scanning tunneling microscope image of a silicon surface. It was done by a very good friend of mine at National Research Council in Canada. And what he's done is created a molecular wire on the surface. He's taken a scanning tunneling microscope tip, and this is in this vacuum, okay, this ultra-high vacuum. He's taken a tip, and he's come down with the tip, and he's touched the surface up here of the silicon, and he's created a reactive site. And then he's introduced a very small pressure of styrene molecules. That's the monomer in polystyrene. And the styrene molecules react with that reactive site, and they start a chain reaction. The reactive site is passed to the next silicon. Another styrene comes in, and the reactive site is passed to the next silicon. Another styrene comes in. And long linear chains of assembled styrene molecules are formed on the surface. And just like those pyrene groups in my cyclic peptide nanotube could be conduits for conduction of electrons, these styrene molecules, this is what the surface looks like if you look at it from the side, these styrene molecules can also allow conductivity or conduction of electrons along this line here. Each one of these really poorly focused white blobs is a single styrene molecule. And that's one of the images I was talking about that really kind of blew me away when I, finally convinced me that maybe chemistry was the right choice for me.
What kind of current? What kind of current?
Yes, sir?
Milliamperes,
You know what? I don't know if they know that yet. I mean, it's not particularly conducting. Okay, it's going to be a very small current, obviously because you're talking about individual molecules. I don't know what sort of voltage you have to apply in order to get it to be reasonably conducting. It's kind of semi-proof of principle. This is another picture that I love. This is an individual molecule. This is a scanning tunneling microscope image of a molecule. Its acronym is TEMPO. I don't need to go into the chemical structure of that. This is sitting on a silicon surface. These wavy lines here are basically a representation of the rows of silicon atoms on the surface. And this blob is this TEMPO molecule that's come down and attached itself to the silicon surface. This is, I should point out, I mean, the colors here are for visualization only. I mean, we're talking about sizes that are much smaller than the wavelengths of light, so these things can't be visualized optically. What we're really looking at is a topographical map of the electronic structure of the surface. So in some areas, there's more conductivity off of the surface than in others, and that's what's being presented here in this STM image. How are we doing for time? So I'm not quite sure when I started, so this could be the 24-hour lecture we talked about. Molecules also act as switches, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I'm showing kind of a progression here from the basic research laboratory to the patent office, okay? Just again to kind of emphasize the fact that this is not just in the realm of basic science. People are investing in this. This is a rotaxane molecule. It's a combined wire and switch. If it's attached to metal contacts at either end and a voltage is applied, this ring, this bead here, moves back and forth, and when it moves back and forth, the current is turned on and off in the molecule. The idea is to attach either end of this molecule to two nanowires and again apply voltage across and use this as a switch, and in the process build some fairly highly complex electronic architecture of the sort that you would find in today's semiconductor chips. This work was done in particular by Fraser Stoddard and Jim Heath at UCLA, and Stan Williams, who's head of the quantum computing group at Hewlett-Packard. So again, there's some pretty heavy hitters on the industrial or corporate side doing this sort of work. Other applications, nanoscale data storage. I'm just going to skip over this a little bit. This is kind of a neat idea for storing data with very high densities. You'd take an AF, this is an artist rendition. This is an atomic force microscope tip, and you'd burn a hole in a polymer. And that hole would represent a 0-bit or a 1-bit if you're looking for storing data. This would be the whole array of data here, and this would be the writing process. The reading process for getting this data back would be achieved by a large array of these AFM tips. And where they hit a bump, that would be a bit. Couple of neat pictures. You know, if you want to make these devices, you want to make materials do things that devices do, you need to be able to manipulate them. We've already kind of talked about AFM and STM. This is an STM image spelling out IBM. These are individual xenon atoms on the surface. And moving up a scale, this is a molecular abacus. These are individual buckyballs. These are Buckminster fullerene molecules that have been moved around on the surface by an STM tip. Now, I don't think this is really going to be particularly useful from a computational viewpoint, but it just proves that you can move things around, that you can manipulate matter, and you can make them do things that you want them to do. An image here, this is, I don't know how they got the gear on this ant's paw. I'm hoping that no animals were injured during this process. This is one of today's micro rotors, little micro machine. This is a nanoscale motor, a rotor actually, and it's 10,000 times smaller than this. So that gives you an idea of the amount of miniaturization that can still be achieved and the amount of complexity that can be introduced into devices as a result. Just want to say a couple of things about medicine, and then I'll close and we can have some questions. This is another plug for me, by the way. I've done a lot of work in designing molecules that can act as sensors for constituents in the blood. Nanomedicine at this point in time, I think, is really kind of confined to sensors. This is really kind of molecular engineering here. We've designed this molecule. This is a molecular modeling representation of a molecule that binds sodium ions. Obviously, if you're analyzing blood, you want to be able to measure the amount of sodium in the blood. This is very highly selective for sodium, so that's part of the idea behind designing the molecule. Engineered into the molecule is also a transduction mechanism, which allows us to have fluorescence emitted when we have the ion bound. This is another sort of medical application of nanotechnology. This is a gold surface, and attached to this is a strand of DNA. Again, it's a molecular modeling representation. And the website said that I needed to acknowledge where I got it from. This would be something that you might find in a gene chip or some sort of diagnostic chip. And then maybe in the future, the not too distant future, you could think of combining a sensing function with a diagnostic function, a diagnostic function or a sensing function with a therapeutic function. So you could think of tying together maybe a buckyball with a drug, and perhaps that buckyball could sense the presence of a particular analyte, something that would indicate that there was a need for a drug, and that would cause the release of the drug. So kind of this all-in-one package, a sensor for determining whether you're sick, and then a drug to help you get better. And that's really kind of the end of the real science. This is now in the realm of someone's imagination. This might be a medical nanorobot of the future. It would incorporate a number of different functionalities, sensors, perhaps a reservoir with a drug, some sort of shell that would make it non-enzymatically degradable in the body, and maybe even wireless capability so that it can communicate to something outside of the body. And finally, just to close at that, I don't have a handout. This is basically Nancy's handout. If you want more information, you can definitely go to the website or the web page that Nancy had up on her screen. contact me. I'd be very happy to talk to any of you about this. And thanks for your attention.
Well, I hope you've thought of some good questions because Nancy and Grant have agreed to stick around for a while and have a discussion with you. So if we could do that for a few minutes, and I don't want to keep you all here too long, so we'll do this for a few minutes, and then if you want to leave, certainly feel free to do so. And I'm sure Nancy and Grant would love to stay around as long as any of you would like to chat about this. So with that, questions.
Right. But before the questions get started, I'd just like to point out that if you do pick up a handout and you want to see the original color version, the last line gives you the URL for the original.
So I guess we're going to use the microphone, so raise your hand, somebody else to you with the microphone.
Yeah, I guess I have a question.
Where are you?
I'm sorry, right here.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I'm a WPI alum.
Hey.
I first got exposed to this about 10 or 15 years ago by a book from an MIT professor. Was it Drexel, Engines of Creation? Drexler. And that book really...
Is he a professor? I thought he went to MIT.
I think he's an alum of MIT.
Oh, maybe he's an alum.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, I thought it was pretty far out back then, but that was like 15 years ago. And I was just wondering what your impression was on some of his speculation.
A lot of it is speculation, yeah.
I think it's still pretty far out.
You think he's still pretty far out?
Right.
Okay.
But he brought a lot of attention to the field, so any advertising is good advertising. But no, I don't know. I don't always believe that.
I think in Chemical and Engineering News, there was an exchange between Drexler and Smalley, who was one of the discoverers of the buckyball, on Drexler's ideas. Kind of entertaining, actually. And if you just search for nanotechnology debate on Google, you probably come up with it.
Yes, question. What's the largest structure that's been made out of nanotubes so far?
There are several different transistors. I don't know of an integrated circuit out of carbon nanotubes. Do you agree?
No.
No. That would be a dream. And what's happening at the moment is we're doing the study, we in the sense of scientists, are doing the studies, and we can take our atomic force microscope or a tunneling microscope, and we can manipulate one of these tubes at a time, or maybe two or three. But imagine trying to do that 2 million times to make the equivalent of Pentium. So this is where the ideas from the bottom up people become very important. How do you use the properties of the molecules themselves to get them to go where you want them to go? With maybe, as Grant showed us, a little poke to initiate the creation of a wire, for example. Or DNA. Yeah, and there is at least one researcher who's using DNA to get proteins into specific parts, points on the surface, and I believe she attaches metals to them in order to try and understand things to make devices. So part of the excitement, and neither of us actually mentioned it before, is that I'm starting to talk to a chemist.
And I'm starting to talk to a physicist.
Right. And we're all starting to talk to biologists. And so it's really very interesting.
Caroline has a question up in the back.
Hi, Grant. Question with regard to your peptide chain, where you're in the realm of DNA and RNA and the building blocks of life. Is there any concern about viruses and bacteria and things of that nature or are they just too large relative to this?
I think there is concern about that. There's a growing field of nanoethics, and it's not nano to mean
meaning
very
we
small
don't have
amount
any.
of ethics. But I think there's a lot of concern. There's maybe some misplaced concern, but not all of it. In the case of these cyclic peptide nanotubes, these are pretty inert structures. You actually have to boil them in hydrochloric acid to get them to come apart. They're not enzymatically degradable, and they're going to stop assembling whenever there's no more cyclic peptides around. But yeah, you're right. There is some concern. I'm getting some feedback here. I should move over.
Okay. Up in Caroline's section again, I guess.
Well, the previous speaker touched on something that I was thinking. Is there any difficulty, or can you envision any difficulty in stopping the assembly of some of these atoms and molecules?
Pray.
That's P-R-E-Y, I think you're talking about. Right?
Yeah.
Has anyone read Pray?
I've read Pray.
Yeah, a few people. Who was it that wrote that?
Michael Crichton.
Crichton, yeah, Michael Crichton wrote a book called Prey, which is basically the uncontrolled assembly of
swarms.
Yeah, swarms of really nasty things, right?
Yeah, right.
In this
8 people, I think.
It did all sorts of nasty stuff. Yeah. These sorts of assemblies can be quenched pretty easily by removing the feedstock, if you like, and they can be disrupted. It might take some doing to pull apart some of these structures, but I don't see any sort of uncontrolled proliferation of this sort of device or this sort of structure.
There are lots of questions in the front. If some of the microphones could move down here.
At a neutrino, what would happen? If a nanotube met a neutrino,
a physics question.
I knew you'd come in handy.
Oh, thank you. Useful. Right. Neutrinos are neat things. They are one of the very, very many particles in the subatomic zoo. People are even now trying to decide, even if they have mass, they're so small. Neutrinos bury through things much, much better than just about anything else. There are a whole bunch of neutrinos coming from the sun. And we get them even at night because I think the majority of them pass through the entire Earth because they don't interact with things very well. So if a neutrino met a carbon nanotube, nothing would happen. Now, that's a specific question, but the general question, I think, is something we have to think about. And the general question is, well, you've got these things that are dependent on one molecule or one thing that's very, very small. You get a piece of dust in there or a cosmic ray comes in, and boom, just one cosmic ray and the whole device has gone kaput. So you have to build in redundancies in order to protect your device from radiation. And there is already a fair body of knowledge on that in the aerospace engineering and the people who send things to Mars and so forth. So we have to incorporate those ideas, but we also have to incorporate the idea of redundancy. We individually are getting hit by cosmic rays all the time, and more or less we're still alive. So the biology has sort of figured that out in that we're composed of millions and millions of cells. If we lose one cell, too bad.
Okay. Another question over here?
Yeah. The whole idea of the gray ooze, which Drexler engendered with his Engines of Creation book, and there sort of was an anti-reaction to that a lot of people downplayed, kind of has gone away for the most part. But people like Bill Joy, and perhaps should know better or otherwise, are now talking about a moratorium on nanoscience and technology because of the danger of nanoparticles infecting the human body, and things of that nature, as opposed to the gray ooze eating us. Any comments?
No.
Well, I guess that's a really good question. I've heard that one raised myself many times. And I guess the question is, other than these manufactured by scientists type nanoparticles, are there nanoparticles available generally occurring in nature?
Or manufactured ones by accident. I mean,
sure.
I'm more scared going out in Boston traffic.
I mean, one of the basic nanoparticles is a molecule. And we're exposed to all sorts of nasty molecules as we step out into Boston traffic. And I think these particles are a lot more ubiquitous than anything that's been engineered as a specific nanoparticle at this point. I mean, I don't have an answer for that. I can't see into the future. But at this point, I'm not concerned about it.
Right. Although I think it's a good question to ask, and there are people, every time they're confronted with change or something they don't understand, they go, oh, no, it's too dangerous. If you've been to Europe, you see how the public reacts to genetic modification. And I went into Sainsbury's, an English supermarket, 2 summers ago, and I burst out laughing because I looked at a chicken, and there was a label on it in bright yellow. It said, this chicken was not fed genetically modified food. I'm not kidding. But certainly, we do have to be careful about what we're doing, and a lot of our research is funded by the taxpayer, and I think part of our job is to talk to people about what we do and make it a little bit less scary. And that, in part, we've had these discussions at technical meetings, and that, in part, was the reason why I did this poster, just as my little contribution to public information.
Well, I guess the specifics of the question really. Yeah, real quick. Specific of the question really relates to things like the perhaps prion model of mad cow disease, and if one of Grant's cyclic peptides, happen to start curdling your brain or something,
I'm not responsible. I think it's a really good point. I think that we have an opportunity, really, kind of at the outset of wide-scale nanotechnology to investigate these problems in a very systematic way. We're not going to have that opportunity 20 years from now because there's going to be development in so many areas. But more at the beginning, I think it represents a good opportunity.
Had a question over here?
Yeah, I guess I've got the mic next. I've got, two things. The first one is, if they can create havoc, they also can fight and be able to bring it under control. Mm-hmm. But I was reading in Nature a few months ago, and they said that funding of nanotechnology in China is about 5 to 10 times greater there than here. And the other thing is that they're paying people over there to publish papers in international journals. Do you think there's going to be a nano race here, or are you guys going to move over to China where all the money is?
I can't believe that there's that much money available in China for research.
What's the latest NNI is 4 billion? 4 billion.
Right.
Nature's wrong again?
There's one over here somewhere.
All right. What are some realistic applications in a timeline of nanotechnology devices? For instance, last year there was a nano LED developed by a company in Switzerland. And I don't know how many people saw the Minority Report, but in that movie you would see people reading a newspaper that was actually like a television screen as thin as a piece of paper. So what are some actual realistic applications of nanotechnology and a timeline?
Well, I mean, if you have double glazed windows, you're using nanotechnology now. Take a look at them, and between the two panes of glass, you'll usually see a small metallic grill. Inside of that are zeolites, which are nanoparticles which absorb water and prevent fogging between the windows. If you launder your clothes, you're using nanoparticles as a way to get your clothes clean. I mean, some detergents are as I think as much as 50% zeolite. So there's nanotechnology now. I think there's molecular electronics, the application of nanotechnology to that. Well, it's already there when we talk about top-down nanotechnology. There is a chip foundry in Taiwan that aims to create devices 9 nanometers on a side. I don't know how they're going to do it defect-free. They might have to throw out 99% of the chips that they make. So there are kind of these technologies that are bridging the gap between top-down and bottom-up, putting together, say, a nanowire with a molecule. You have more of a top-down wire and you have a bottom-up switch. So these things are happening now. I think the longer-term applications of nanotechnology will come in medicine. So just by the very fact that we are very careful about what we put into our bodies and how we treat our bodies with drugs. So I don't know. You might want to.
This device here, the data storage device based on AFM technology, is being worked on actively at IBM Zurich, and they hope to have a product in 3 years. And it would be data storage not for your computer, but for your personal digital assistant, for your combined GPS, fax, telephone, wristwatch. But you'll have it's fairly expensive, but very, very high storage densities. I think 10 gigabytes per square inch or something like that.
But it takes $1.5 million microscope to read the whole
That's not going to be on your wrist.
That's not going to be on your wrist. Unless Rolex wants to get into that. But no, they do have the consumer pocketbook in mind, and they are making this device using the same kind of top-down computer lithographic techniques with high redundancy and a zillion, well, I'll be scientific here, several thousand devices per wafer, so they can make them cheaply. So it wouldn't be millions of dollars. I would think it would be a couple $100 to start with.
Maybe I could close by simply getting both of your opinions as to timeline here. I mean, it strikes me that we're sort of in the beginning stages of constructing elements of some devices, but we yet have to figure out how to build the devices and make them functional. So, what are we talking about in terms of timeline until we see some engineered products based on nanotechnologies?
Well, for this one, IBM says 3 years.
3 years.
Electronics, maybe 5 to 10.
Okay, so pretty soon. Things are changing fast.
Yeah.
Could we thank Grant and Nancy and